I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tammy Brush Campbell, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at Gettysburg College. And I'm pleased to be your Zoom host today. And also, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Professor Fee in just a moment, but a couple housekeeping tips. If at possible, if you could stay muted unless you would like to ask questions, which you are free to do so throughout the presentation. And also, just for your knowledge, we are recording this session so that we can present it to families at a later date who may not be able to join us today. So with that said, I would like to introduce you to Professor Christopher Fee. He's professor of English at Gettysburg College. He's been with us for 23 years. And we are so happy to have him. I'm also delighted to say that I work with his wife, Allison, who is the director of parent relations for Gettysburg College. So you probably have seen her name at one point or another, Allison Singley. Chris and Allison make a lovely couple and are a great addition to our Gettysburg family. So with that said, I will turn it over to Professor Fee and we will get started.
Well, thank you so much, Tammy. That was very gracious, and thank you all for joining me, or for joining us, I should say, on a Saturday afternoon. I'll try to make it worth your while, and I'll try not to blather on too much. I did prepare what I think is actually a lovely slideshow with a lot of great images of dragons and dragon-like creatures from around the world, so that you don't just have to stare at this head the whole time. Although I'll tell you, between drinking coffee and wearing a face mask, I often feel like my breath is very dragon-like. So I've got that going for me. And I did, for anybody in the crowd who's Welsh, I wore my vintage Welsh nationalist tie with the little red dragon on there from the 50s. But the image behind me is actually a detail of an image we'll look at more closely later on in the presentation. So what I want to do is just kind of talk generally about what kind of common popular perceptions of dragons are, how varied that sometimes can be, especially over the last couple of thousand years, and talk about really where some of our ideas come from. Especially for people who would know some of the more popular visions of dragons. I want to start out by saying that I'm a medievalist by training. So I specifically am trained in really the Britain and Scandinavia between kind of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, so the mid 400s, the mid 5th century, and around the time of Shakespeare, which is about 1,000 years later. And so that's my my strong suit. And so you'll see a lot of representation from British and Scandinavian dragons. But having said that, I also do a lot of work in comparative. Here's a geeky term for you: comparative Indo-European mythology. And so, interestingly, we're going to look at some images of dragons or dragon people from as far away as medieval Persia, modern-day Iran, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the kind of the Middle East, and also as far away as India, which has some important mythological connections with Western Europe. And we'll touch very lightly on some Asian ideas because sometimes, in some cultures, and notably in some Asian cultures, dragons can be really be tokens of good luck. They don't tend to be in medieval Western Europe, as we'll see. And we'll also touch upon some biblical dragons, which do tend to be double unplus good. I mean, just really bad creatures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my little slideshow, which does not keep you from asking questions, but you'll have to let me know when you have them. Glenda, were you waving at me? with the question? Oh, okay. I thought you were jumping right in there, so I was going to make sure that you were able to do so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. We'll see, and I'll share my computer sound too. And I will share that, and we will start. And then I guess I will start the slideshow. Start from the beginning, yeah. All right, and I'm going to collapse a little something here. So here I have a little image just to get us started, which is from Game of Thrones, which some of you may have heard of, which is a giant kind of popularization of really what I would call medievalism. Kind of ideas that we tend to associate with the Middle Ages, and kind of lifestyles and costuming and all that sort of thing. And as we'll see, really at the very end of the presentation, the dragons, as they're presented in that particular popular program, have a lot to do with actually legends of King Arthur. I'm teaching a course on King Arthur this fall, and we've been talking about that. And that's also a reason why I have my Welsh nationalist tie on. But I want to start off by talking about the fact that dragons are traditionally, and especially in the Northwest Europe, which is my area of expertise, dragons often don't have wings, which may surprise some people. They sometimes do. But as we'll see a little later in the presentation, in Old Norse, which is the language of the Vikings, which is a really important source of some of our material, there's a distinction made between dreki, which is a dragon, which is like an ormer is another word, or wyrm in Old English, worm, like a snake, and fludreki, flying dragons. This distinction is often made. So I want to start off by talking about one of the most popular recent images of this kind of creature that you may not have thought of as a dragon. But that is the basilisk of the second Harry Potter novel, and specifically here, the second Harry Potter movie. A basilisk is actually, it comes from basilikos in Greek, meaning little king. And there is some evidence that with some of these dragon themes, there are actual creatures which are sort of the tiny, tiny little grain of factual sand in this lustrous pearl of myth and fiction and folklore. And in this case, some people think that the basilisk may have been founded upon actual knowledge of cobras, which are, of course, terribly deadly. It's interesting that they are developed into, they're not always huge. They can be smaller, but they're in the Middle Ages, they develop into what's called a cockatrice. And as we're going to see in a minute, there is some further development with that. But they traditionally have this enemy, the weasel. And it's interesting because I've already mentioned comparative Indo-European mythology. If you know kind of some of the Indic mythology that comes to us through Rudyard Kipling, you may remember from my childhood, I certainly remember Rikki Tikki Tavi, which is the brave mongoose who battles the evil cobras. And interestingly, in the medieval tradition, you have almost exactly this. You have this basilisk, and here you'll see it's a medieval vision of the basilisk, and it's developed. It's no longer just a snake-like creature, right? But you'll notice its deadly enemy is the weasel, which is pretty interesting when you think about it, especially if you know that story of Rikki Tikki Tavi, especially if you know that Kipling knew his comparative Indo-European mythology. Whatever you want to say about Kipling, and there's plenty to say, that's undeniably true. He actually wrote a children's book called the Puckapook's Hill, which I reference regularly in my folklore class, because it's kind of the germ of the idea, which gives us, I don't know if you know Neil Gaiman's American Gods, but there's a kind of version of that story from 100 years ago, a children's version of that story from 100 years ago by Kipling. He knew his mythology pretty well. But in any case, this particular basilisk here is from a 13th century manuscript. So that's the 1200s. And you can see it may, to your mind, remind you more of a dragon because, of course, it has wings. And it also has claws. So they're cock's claws in this case, but still. So it's got kind of that snaky aspect, but now it also has the wings and the claws that might make it seem a little bit more like the scaly dragon that you remember. Another interesting point about the medieval basilisk is it develops into this idea that it's wrought from an egg laid by a cock. How that's going to work, I'll let my friends in the biology department work out, but then hatched by a serpent. And the basilisk was said to be able to kill with a look, which is an important part of that Harry Potter story, if you remember it. But the sound of cockcrow was also said to be fatal to this creature, as well as its traditional enemy, the weasel. And this weasel here clearly is able to look at the cockatrice or the basilisk and live, although the man there on the other side has clearly died. So that's just to give you an idea that we have these often. This is a great example of a very early idea of a monster that is sort of dragon-like and develops more dragon-like features over time, but also might be based in an actual creature, which is deadly. And we're going to see later on, we're going to talk about returning crusaders who bring stories with them, specifically the story of St. George, the dragon slayer. And it's interesting that these travelers' tales sometimes develop into what we would think of as mythology or folklore, but they sometimes have roots that are somewhat historical. I'm going to move on here. Oops, sorry, hit my wrong button. Now, I want to take you even further back a little bit. This is from the British Museum, and it's a cylinder seal. So it's one of those seals that you can roll out the clay, and then it hardens, and it has it becomes this flat object that's got the picture on it. And here we have Tiamat, and Tiamat sometimes is seen as snake-like, and in this particular image, it doesn't appear to have wings, but it does have some horns there. I'll see if I can show you where see the horns are, and here's the snout, and then it's kind of the snake-like body afterwards, which is kind of more one of these ormer kind of creatures. But the reason I'm pointing this out is because across world mythology, we often have this dragon-like creature that is based fundamentally on notions of snakes, giant serpents. And they are closely associated with the ground for the obvious reason that, that snakes live in the ground, or they can live in the water as well, which is something else we'll talk about. But my point being, they're associated with the ground. And then their enemies are generally associated with the sky. So it's often the battle between this elemental earth force, which represents the ground, or in fact, people are put into the ground after death. It represents the other world. It represents death. It represents the forces arrayed against the forces of life. And then the sky god over top represents light and life and laughter and all of that, and is often the mortal enemy. And you can see here that we think this is Ninurta, and he's holding kind of wedge tip. He's holding kind of arrows, or you might almost see these as kind of lightning bolts, which is often associated with the sky god, who is in mortal combat with this earth demon, which is this dragon creature. And those of you who know your Norse mythology will realize that that's one of the most obvious oppositions that we see in a field that's much closer to me, which is Scandinavian studies, Norse mythology. This is a fairly late, this is not a medieval manuscript, this is an 18th century manuscript, but it often gets recopied because it's such a beautiful expedition. And here you are, beautiful illustration of Thor's fishing expedition. So Thor is a traditional thunder god, and we're actually going to see 2 or 3 examples of this today from of these thunderers from the Indo-European tradition. And Thor is the one that is most commonly known amongst my students, and I would assume most commonly known amongst this group today. You know, even before the Marvel Comics series and the movie franchises, Thor was a very well-known god. What you might not know is that he was a beloved god in Scandinavia, because Odin, who's this traditional war god, and he's also to a certain extent a god of the sky, and he's the father, he's the all-father, he's the father of the gods. But he is chaotic. He has demonic blood. He also does what needs to be done to get the job done, and that means he's not very loyal. Thor is loyal and steadfast, and he brings the soft rains for the crops. He controls the weather for ships, and he battles Jormungandr. Jormungandr is the great world serpent. And there's this great story. You may also know that Thor was a giant killer. But he has this weird relationship with the giants, because when they're not killing each other, they're kind of pals, and or at least they'll do things together. And here Thor is fishing, and his companion is Hymir, the giant. And the story of this has to do with the fact that Hymir had this beautiful ox. He loved this ox, and Thor wants to go fishing, and so he gets the giant to take him fishing in his giant boat, right? But Thor needs bait, so he kills the ox. He takes the head. He uses the ox head to fish for Jormungandr, and he actually catches the giant world serpent. It's called that because it encircles. It's in the ocean, which encircles the earth, right? And it circles all the way around, so it's huge. And Thor catches it with this ox head. And he's pulling it out, and the whole world is shaking. Hymir is just, he's totally freaked out by this, and he ends up cutting the line so that Jormungandr gets away. And that story is important for a number of reasons. One of them is that Thor continues to be at odds with Jormungandr all the way until Ragnarok, the doom of the gods. And in fact, they kill each other. They're such elemental enemies that at the final battle, when the gods, basically the gods represent order and structure and all the things we need for a human world. And the giants and the demons, they represent chaotic forces of nature that in the Northland are always trying to kill you. You know, the cold weather, the volcanic eruptions, you know, earthquakes, tidal waves, bad years for crops, whatever. And in this final battle, of course, fundamentally the gods lose. Spoiler alert. But what's really interesting is each of the gods faces their elemental enemy, and Thor faces Jormungandr. Thor kills Jormungandr, but the great serpent actually spews so much venom on him on Thor as the serpent is dying, that Thor stumbles back 9 steps, collapses, and dies. So that's an important aspect of the story that kind of takes this rather funny fishing story and puts it into this broader cosmological context. But beyond that, something you wouldn't know if you didn't know anything about comparative Indo-European mythology is that the notion of the ox head is really important here. When we look at the Iranian epic and the classical language of Iran and the classical language of India, they're both Indo-European languages. They are associated with most of the European languages. It's very hard to tell for most people, especially because of the scripts with which they're written, and specifically because Iranian, Farsi is written with an Arabic script, and so it looks like Arabic to us, and we don't tend to think of it as a related language, but it is, and the mythologies are closely related. And the great, as we're going to see, the great dragon slayer of that tradition, he wields Gurz. Gurz is a great name, G-U-R-Z, Gurz. You know, I have Gurz. Gurz is the mighty ox-headed cudgel. And so this idea of the thunderer or the hammerer, sometimes it's a hammer that can fly through the sky. Sometimes it's this ox-headed cudgel. But this is the thunder god, the sky god, at constant battle with his enemy, the elemental earth forces of death, represented by a dragon. I just want to take us back to Egypt for a moment and point out that this is a modern painting. It's a modern facsimile of an ancient Egyptian wall painting that you can go see at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But why I point it out is because it's not, Egyptian mythology is not closely related to the Indo-European traditions. It's a different tradition. But what's interesting is here, it's also, the snake with the blade represents Ra, the sun god, who is battling a Pepe, who is this Egyptian snake god, representing the forces of death and so forth. And this particular image resonates with the cat killing the serpent in chapter 17 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So I just mention it to show that, first of all, it's a nice image. Secondly, you can go see this in the Metropolitan Museum of Art someday, probably not this weekend, but someday soon. But also to show that this is an idea we see in a lot of mythologies. This idea that these snake creatures, they represent death. As we see in we're going to talk about how the Garden of Eden story is reinterpreted through a Byzantine lens that gives us a story closely related to that of St. George battling the dragon. But so these ideas of the sky god at constant battle with the snake figure who represents death and the underworld. You see this throughout world mythologies. But it sometimes is played out as we see in Christian belief, or in Judeo-Christian, I should say, the Garden of Eden, and also, of course, in Revelations, where you see a dragon is clearly representative of evil. So it's not just death and destruction in that case, it's like the destruction of the soul, right? And so this is an idea I think most of us find familiar, but it's an ancient idea, and you see it in a lot of different places, is my point. I want to point out that you may also know creatures like the Hydra. And again, this is not specifically a dragon the way you might envision it, but it comes from really the same roots. And this is, of course, a very fun and interesting spin, because it's about the idea, really, of when you have, because Heracles, or Hercules in the Roman tradition, he's a demigod, right? So he's representative of the sky god. But here, the thing about the Hydra, of course, is every time you cut off one of its heads, new heads spring. You actually make it bigger and worse, right? So here he's working with his pal, and he's clubbing the heads. And I want to point out, Heracles traditionally also utilizes the club as a weapon. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, we see this really commonly. And as I said, this is related to the Iranian Ferdun and his Gringotts, but we're going to see this in the Byzantine epic in a moment as well. So there's this idea of the club as this very important, and I think it's often associated with the hammer of the thunderer. But of course, it's also this problem solving, because what he has to do is he has to have his buddy cauterize the stumps, right? And so it's not simply about fighting the forces of death and of chaos, but it's how do you stop that? Because it's always replicating itself. And in real life, of course, we know that it's just not that easy to solve these kinds of problems. But this myth is really emblematizes this idea that that's what we have to do. We have to think about how, not just to destroy, but how to keep the new evil from springing up in the place of the old evil. So that's a great story that I think most of you find familiar, but also fits into this tradition, which is why I include it. Now here's a story that I love to teach, and I teach a medieval epic course. And I teach a number of epics that you would know. Beowulf is an example. And also like Roland, the Song of Roland, if you read it in French class in 9th grade or something. And so my students tend to know several of them, but then there are several that are just these wonderful stories that most people don't know, and not just most lay people. Most medievalists I know, and even most classicists, well, the classicists I know actually know Digenis Acritas. They know the story, at least they know it exists, but they often don't have much conversance with it. It's really the province of Byzantinists. And when I say Byzantium, I'm talking about the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire. And you'll remember from history, I hope, that Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, he divides the Roman Empire into two parts, and the eastern part is ruled from a new capital that he very immodestly names after himself, Constantinople, which is modern Istanbul. But what's really interesting is that this particular story, it has clear resonance. We're going to talk about St. George and the Dragon in a moment, because St. George is also from Turkey, and that's what you need to realize. These are Anatolian stories. Byzantium, at the very end, when it's taken by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, which obviously just a few decades before Columbus comes to the Americas, right? This isn't even really late medieval anymore. This is really kind of early modern, from my perspective anyway. By the time that Constantinople falls, it's really the city-state itself that still is independent of the Turks. But even a few hundred years before that, it was still a pretty mighty empire. And the story of Digenis Acritas is the story of, his name actually means the two-blooded border lord, and Acritas is like a military officer on the Byzantine frontier, basically fighting against the Syrians. But what's interesting about this epic is it has almost nothing to do with that sort of struggle. It has much more to do with struggles with these elemental or spiritual enemies. And here, the story is imbued specifically with the story of the Garden of Eden, so that most of us who know the story of Adam and Eve would recognize the familiar elements. So you have this young warrior and his beautiful young bride, always referred to as the girl. There's an aspect of innocence to both of them. All the way to the point they die. He dies very young in an echo of the death of Alexander, which is another, kind of Macedonian or Greek tradition. But there's also this scene where the girl is approached in the garden by this stunningly handsome young man, kind of satanic figure, who tries to seduce her. And then when he fails, he turns into the serpent dragon with 3 heads, which is very common in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek world. And you may remember the Shield of Agamemnon, for example. So part of this story is really this dragon battle in the Garden of Eden, as it were. Excuse me. So it's taking a number of these traditions and it's explicitly putting them into really a Greek Orthodox reading of the story of the Garden of Eden. So it's well worth knowing about. And when you're in Athens, you can go see. This is just a little dish, and it's not the most beautiful image we look at, but it's a really important story in this tradition that most Americans I know have never heard of before. But I do want to talk about someone from Cappadocia, which is to say Anatolia, which is to say modern-day Turkey, another Byzantine figure, and that's St. George. And St. George is familiar to us. And most of us know, for example, I'm an old rugby player, but if you happen to like soccer, you may know, your English Premier League soccer, for example. Yeah, and you always see the English flag is just not the British Union Jack, but the English flag is a white field with a red cross on it, and that's the cross of St. George. And what's really interesting is that this is a story, and here you can see St. George actually spearing this this great serpent monster that is, clearly indicative of a particular kind of dragon, but the kind of dragon that we've talked about before, the wingless kind, right? And this is from what's called the Snake Church in Turkish, which is an unfinished cave church in Turkey. And there are these beautiful murals, and this is one of them. And what's really interesting is that they're actually wearing pretty accurate depictions of Byzantine military garb. And here we see George stabbing his long spear into the huge serpent, which is where the snake church gets its name from. But this is also this really important story of really it's a conversion narrative. It's in the Golden Legend, if you know the Golden Legend. But it's based really on the story of Perseus and Andromeda. But in this kind of Christian context. It is not just Christianized, it becomes this conversion narrative. And then it's a very popular story that English crusaders take back with them to England. And then St. George becomes first the patron of the Order of the Garter and then the patron of England. And this is not an English saint, but it's probably the notion of St. George and the Dragon. This is, unlike, Digetasakritas, I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have, of course, heard before. But it's, again, it's this Eastern Mediterranean tradition. It comes to England with crusaders. And I find that fascinating, and I always like to point that out. But again, here, rather like with Heracles, we're no longer, you're no longer seeing the sky god himself. You're seeing the sky god representative. So in this case, as you can tell by the halo here, this is Christ's representative on earth. So it's the saint acting in place of his god to battle the serpent, which of course in a Judeo-Christian context we see as Satan. And this is made manifest for us not just in Genesis, but of course in Revelations as well. Now I want to take us back to Scandinavia for a moment. First of all, because I want to show you this beautiful, beautiful wood carving. The thing about Scandinavian art of the Viking Age and really a couple of centuries both before and after that. The Viking Age really begins at the very end of the 8th century. The first of the huge, big Viking raids is at Lindisfarne in 793. It's not the first Viking raid, but it's within a couple of years of the first raid. And normally we would say that probably you call the Viking Age to end, around the year 1000 when the Icelanders, at least in theory, convert to Christianity, or 1066, because not only did William the Conqueror face Alfred of England, but not Alfred of England, sorry. Harold Godwinson, the King of England. But Harold Godwinson had defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge a Viking army, basically, just previous to the Battle of Hastings, which is one of the reasons why the Norman French, who were themselves Scandinavian, hence the name Norman, one of the reasons they were victorious. But the reason I mention all that is because a lot of the art of this period that's really beautiful, it was in textiles, and it was in woodworking. And wood, of course, burns and rots, and especially when you have a lot of battles and raids, people burn things. And so a lot of things are not preserved. But here we have a beautiful carving from what's called the Sigurd portal. There are a number of these stave churches in Norway. And they're kind of post and beam construction, which is kind of where you get the idea of the stave church. But they have this beautiful, beautiful ornate carvings. And this is a Christian church, but it has this story of the great dragon slayer, Sigurd, of the Scandinavian saga of the Volsungs, which you might know better because the Mittelhochdeutsch, the Middle High German version, the Nibelungenlied, is the source of Wagner's Ring Cycle. And what's really fascinating about this is not just that we have this beautiful wood carving, not just that it's an Ormer kind of dragon. It's the serpent kind of dragon that is most popular in Northwestern Europe, but also that the mythological story behind this tells us that this dragon was once a man, but he became transformed by his greed and by his murder of his own father to get this cursed treasure that Odin and Loki and Heimdallr, I think, had managed to get. They had to pay a ransom with it, and it was cursed for a number of reasons. And so this cursed gold, the Rheingold in Wagner's telling, it's at the heart of the most important Northwest European story of a dragon. And Sigurd is that dragon slayer. So it's you really shouldn't talk about medieval dragons without talking about Sigurd. And this is such a beautiful representation of that. And then this idea that greed can transform one into a dragon, who then becomes emblematic, and I mean that in the medieval sense, that it actually represents, to the medieval mind, the dragon represents greed, because if taken to its illogical extreme, it will cause a literal transformation of a human being into a dragon because of the sin of avarice. I just want to point out very briefly here, you can see this a similar story in the Iranian tradition. This is Zohak, and he became a king because he was so greedy that he killed his own father. So you can see the resonance with the story I just told you. And he fell under the spell of this demon Ahriman, who kissed Zohak's shoulders. And then these serpents, they look sort of like kind of question marks of giant elephant ears coming around him there, around his side of his heads there. They're like these cobras on the side of his of either shoulder, and they must be appeased with a daily diet of human brains. So Zohak's the worst kind of tyrant, right? He's not just greedy. He didn't just kill his own father, as I just told you, Fafnir the dragon had done. But he also, of course, required daily sacrifices, daily human sacrifices to appease these serpents. And he is, wait for it, he is defeated by Faradun with Gurts, the ox-headed cudgel I mentioned before. And then he's imprisoned under a mountain, very much like the demon Loki, the trickster figure of the Norse pantheon, is also trapped under a mountain where a serpent spews venom into his face, and his poor long-suffering wife catches the venom and rushes it back out. And when she's out dumping the venom, it falls into Loki's face, and that causes earthquakes. These are very similar stories. And again, this is not entirely incidental. Some of it's incidental and accidental, but some of it comes from deep, common mythological roots. But I just love the guy with the snake shoulders. And this is actually in Toronto. The Canadians won't let us in right now, but when you're up there next, you can check it out. And I do want to point out that Indra is also a dragon slayer and Indo-European thunderer. He brings rain and gentle seasons, right? And he slays Vritra, the dragon of drought, right? And this is actually a Cambodian sandstone. But it's a really cool, very different image. So I wanted to show it to you. But again, sky god who brings the good weather for growth and battles the elemental forces which threaten to destruct the crops and human life. In India, this is representative of a battle against drought. In Northwestern Europe, it's much more likely to be kind of frost giants and the like. But these elemental forces that are often associated with the dragon are battled by the sky god, and so in that sense, you can see Indra as very Thor-like in aspect. I'm just going to talk about this really briefly. This is an ancient figurehead. Well, it's from about, let's say, AD 400, AD 500, what we call the age of migrations, although if you lived in Britain at the time, I think you would call it the age of invasions. But the reason I mention it is it shows two things. One, that these kinds of figures were often seen as protective spirits by the people who utilize them. And two, that this is an older idea than the Viking Age, because this is pre-Viking, but it's the exact same sort of thing. The Vikings put these figureheads, these dragon prow figureheads, into their ships as well. And they were thought to be protective spirits. They protected you on your journey across the water. But of course, they were seen by those the Vikings raided, or those these early Germanic people raided in early Britain. They were seen as representative of the destructive force of dragons and of the people in those ships, even though to the people in the ships, this is a protective spirit. And so there's a duality to it that I think is worth pointing out. I do want to point out a couple of things because we're going to run out of time here in just a few minutes. But the most common idea of this dragon like Fafnir, who's been totally transformed by greed, and what he does is he sits on his pile of gold, and he kills anyone who takes just the smallest piece of gold. Well, that this particular story of Smaug the dragon comes directly from Beowulf. What you may not know is that J.R.R. Tolkien, and actually his buddy C.S. Lewis, they were two of the finest medievalists of the middle part of the 20th century. None of this is accidental when you're talking about Tolkien. He specifically takes the story of what's called the Lay of the Last Survivor, which is a part towards the end of Beowulf, where it talks about this ancient race of people who had put, the last survivor takes all their treasure and puts it into a barrow, a chambered cairn. One of those hills, those artificial hills in the landscape of Britain and Scandinavia that are what we call chambered cairns or tunnel tombs, right? You can go inside, there's a little door in the hill, and you can go inside and there might be treasure in there. The idea is that the dragon finds this and claims it for his own. And then that's what causes the death of Beowulf at the end, and the fact that he saves his people, although only after the destruction of the dragon, and not having ever produced an heir himself. So there's a real kind of pathos at the end of Beowulf. But Smaug the dragon in The Hobbit is taken out of whole cloth from Beowulf. Now, of course, Tolkien makes it his own, but the figure and what it represents is taken directly from Beowulf. And this again takes us into that idea of the destructive power of the dragon, and also their association with greed, with the sin of avarice. I do want to point out that in what we call a cenotaph of the period of conversion, King Redwald of East Anglia, we think he converted to Christianity, but he was hedging his bets. So he was buried on sanctified ground with Christian rites, but he had this empty cenotaph, right, empty tomb with all the grave goods just in case he needed them. And here, if you look at this closely, you can see that the jaws of the dragon are pointing downward, and there's an eye above the jaws, and then there are a set of hinged wings here. And this is from a shield boss. It's a decorative shield mount. But the point that I'm raising here is not only do dragons represent this idea of greed and avarice, but also, as I showed you with the fitting that goes in the front of the ship, they can be protective spirits. And here, the dragon represents a protective spirit that will help in the translation of the soul to the other world. So it is a death spirit, but it's not all negative. It's positive in that it's here in a totemic way to protect the person whose treasure it is. But I do want to point out that Nithogr, who appears in Norse mythology, he is always here. You can see if we went back to the previous slide, you can see there's a certain, if you flip this shield boss around, it kind of looks a little like this figure of Nithogr. And what Nithogr does is he He's chewing always on the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree that the entire universe is suspended amongst the branches of. And what's really interesting about this is that because of contact with Christianity, the Norse apocalypse of Ragnarok is followed by this new dawn, right? And the most Christ-like of the gods, Balder, returns. And Ask and Embla, Ash and Elm, kind of Adam and Eve, they come out of the bark of these trees where they were saved from the apocalypse. But then, right as life is beginning anew, this dragon comes out of really the depths of hell with his wings just strewn with the corpses of the dead. And so, right at the moment of rebirth and relife and the renewing of life and of hope, death reasserts itself in our world. Really kind of the last concept here that I wanted to bring up is, if you remember at the very beginning, my background, my virtual background is of these two dragons battling. And this is a story that is about the young boy Merlin, actually right there, or the figure who develops into the figure of Merlin. And this is about the battle between the white dragon of England and the red dragon you saw in my tie of Wales. And eventually the red dragon will be defeated, but not before Arthur comes and asserts a last golden age of Welsh history. And so what's really interesting about this is this is another way dragons are used to emblematize royalty. And that's the way in which I have a very short video here. Tammy, do I have time to show this? It's about 4 minutes long, or should I wrap up here? I don't know what your advice is for me.
I'd say go ahead unless,
Okay.
feel free if anybody needs to jump off and leave the presentation, but I would go ahead.
Okay, because I'm just about done here. I just wanted to point out that I got asked by Time Magazine a few years ago to talk about dragons specifically in Game of Thrones. And what was really interesting about this is this very idea of the red dragon and its representation, not just of the identity of King Arthur, right, but of all the things he represents. That was really appropriated by George R.R. Martin in Game of Thrones. And so here's a short video, and a little of it kind of goes over a few things we've talked about already, but the production values are really high. So I want to show it to you because I couldn't create this video on my own. So here we go.
Well, dragons never seem to go away, do they? They occur in culture after culture.
Sorry.
They occur in story after story. The idea of being able to live in a world full of magical creatures, well, that offers a certain excitement and joy and curiosity. Dragons are like a canvas upon which we paint our fears and desires as a culture. And I think they remain relevant because they change with us. Well, in today's world, we often define a dragon as a giant, scaly, winged, reptilian beast, often can breathe fire. In the ancient world, this wasn't always the case. They were very often giant serpents of various kinds, and they could be also multivalent. In the Asian world, for example, dragons are often symbols of good luck, good fortune, while in the biblical tradition, on the other hand, dragons are clearly evil. In the Middle Ages, dragons were indeed emblems of greed, avarice. Most people in America today would know that through The Hobbit and Smaug the dragon, who is clearly developed on that exact theme and that trope. In the Arthurian tradition, dragons are associated with the rise of a mighty, powerful royal house, as well as with omens and portents having to do with their demise. It seems to me that in Game of Thrones, this idea of the association with royalty and also portents comes most clearly from the Arthurian tradition, in which dragons might represent omens. One of the ways that dragons myths spread was through travelers coming back with stories of dragons. Imagine, if you will, that you traveled to North Africa from England in the 12th or 13th century and you saw a crocodile. Wouldn't that appear to you to be a monstrous, demonic beast? In our culture, dragons tell us about that which we fear, not just out in the world like a crocodile, but within ourselves like greed. Game of Thrones plays with our sense of light and darkness, the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. And this tension is developed fully in the symbol of the dragon, because the dragon represents great power, but it also represents greed and destruction. And this bringing together of these ideas tells us something about ourselves, both what we fear, what we want, and what we would like to be.
Well, I think that I have tried your patience enough. I have several works in which I touch upon dragons. I did want to show you this early drawing of Smaug the Dragon by J.R.R. Tolkien himself.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Tammy. I
Yep, and
appreciate
thanks everybody who joined us today. And I hope that you will join on some of the other virtual events that we have going on for the rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much.